Hi everyone, you should be on the back of RN6 and this is titled Estimating Square Roots. Now we've been working with perfect squares and today we're going to look at a method that you can use to estimate the square root. So before we actually get into the process, I want you to fill in the number line and we're going to put the squares up there as well as the square root. So this would be 0, 9, and you're just going to fill this in right along. So we're going to just go ahead and fill in all the square roots first, and squares. Okay, and then notice along the bottom I'm going to do my square roots. Okay, so there are all of my squares, and then there are all of my square roots. Now, I need for you to just kind of follow along with what I'm going to do. This might seem confusing at first, and that's okay. We're going to spend some time working with this. So, there are steps to estimating. So the very first thing we need to do when we begin to estimate, and we're going to estimate the square root of 72, is I want to find the nearest perfect squares. So find the nearest perfect square to the radicand and take the square root of those perfect squares. The square root will be in between these two numbers. Okay, so my first step, I want to find the square root of 72. I need to find the nearest perfect squares. Well, the nearest perfect squares are 64 and 81. The square root of 64 is 8. The square root of 81 is 9. So I know that my square root is going to be between 8 and 9. That's step 1. Okay, step 2, you're going to find the difference, so I'm going to be subtracting, between the radicand and the lower perfect square, and then I'm going to find the difference, so again I'm going to subtract, between the two perfect squares. Now, that sounds confusing, but just kind of listen and look. Again, I'm going to go with the radicand. That's the number inside. So I'm going to take the bottom two. So I'm going to subtract 72 and 64, and that's 8. And then I'm actually going to subtract the two perfect squares, 81 minus 64, and that's 17. Okay, and what that's going to do is that's going to make up my fractional part. So now, I found my perfect squares. I figured out between what two square roots. I subtracted the two lower perfect squares, and then I subtracted the two outer perfect squares. Step 3. We're now going to write that difference as a ratio. Okay, we're going to write it as a fraction. And then we're going to rewrite that fraction as a decimal to the nearest hundredth. So as I divide, I'm going to have to put a decimal point and some zeros. And I'm just going to go through here and do this division. And I only need to go 3 decimal places. And then that'll be a 0. Okay. So now what I want to do is I'm going to combine the whole number part and the decimal part for an estimate of the square root. So I'm going to take my 8 and I'm going to add to it 47 hundredths, and I can write this estimate as 8 47/100ths, or if I left it as a fraction, it would be 8 8/17. All right, and that's just one method of estimating. Now, if you're confused, just stay with me. We're going to go through here and do 3 examples together. So let's estimate the square root of 19. So the first thing I need to do is I need to come up with the 2 perfect squares that the square root of 19 will be between. And that's going to be between the square root of 16 and the square root of 25. Which means that my answer is somewhere between 4 and 5. So my next step is going to subtract, and I'm going to get the numerator of this fraction by subtracting the first 2. So I'm going to do 19 minus 16, which gives me 3. That's going to be my numerator. And then I'm going to do the 2 perfect squares, and that's my denominator. 25 minus 16, which will give me 9. So now I know that my square root is approximately 4 3/9, and then I can divide and make that into a fraction, and I know that 3/9 is a third, so that is 4 3/10. So it seems like it's a lot, but it really isn't. Okay, so let's look at the next one. Square root of 30. Square root of 30 is going to be somewhere between the square root of 25 and the square root of 36, which means that it's going to be about 5 point something. I'm going to get my numerator by subtracting the 2 smaller. So I'm going to do 30 minus 25, and that's going to give me 5. And then I'm going to get my denominator by subtracting 36 and 25, and that's going to give me 11. Okay, that forms my fraction, so I know that this is 5 5/11, and then if I divide that out, I know that this is then going to equal 5 45/100. So the square root of 30 is approximately 5.45, or 5 5/11. All right, let's do the last one. Again, I want to find the square root of 110, so that's going to be between the square root of 100 and the square root of 121. Okay, which means it's between 10 and 11. So again, I'm going to subtract 110 and 100, and that's going to be my numerator. 110 minus 100 is going to give me 10, and then my denominator is going to be 121. Write the word denominator there. 121 minus 100, which will give me 21. So my square root, or my approximate square root of 110, is 10 and 10 over 21, or 10 and 48/100. Okay, so again, I find the 2 perfect squares, that what I'm looking for is between. I then subtract the perfect square from the number, smaller one. Then I subtract the two perfect squares. That's how I get my numerator and my denominator. Bring your questions to class tomorrow. We will practice more with this tomorrow.